Elena Voss had never owned anything beautiful. Her cottage was small, her clothes were plain, and her life was quiet in the way that empty things are quiet, not peaceful, just hollow. She lived on the edge of Silverstone territory, where the great wolf packs ruled, and humans like her were tolerated the way one tolerates a stone in a path. You step around it. You do not stop to look at it. She worked as a wildlife caretaker. She healed injured animals, foxes with broken legs, deer with torn sides, birds that had flown into things they did not see coming. People in the nearby settlement thought she was strange, a grown woman who chose animals over people. She did not correct them. Animals, in her experience, were far more honest. The night she found him, the snow was falling in thick, silent sheets. She had gone into the forest after dark because one of her foxes had slipped its pen, and she could not sleep knowing it was out in the cold. She was walking with a lantern in one hand and a wool blanket under her arm when she heard it. A sound so small she nearly missed it. A thin, trembling cry, like something that had used up every bit of its remaining strength to make one last sound. She followed it to a fallen oak tree at the edge of the border path. Curled against the roots, barely visible in the snow, was a wolf cub. He was silver, not gray, silver, the way moonlight is silver, with a faint shine to his fur, even in the dark. He was tiny. She could have held him in two cupped hands. His eyes were closed, and he was shaking with cold, and above his left front paw, pressed into the fur like a brand, was a small crescent-shaped mark that glowed very faintly gold. Elena stood there for 3 full seconds. Then she wrapped him in the wool blanket, tucked him inside her coat against her chest, and walked home. She did not think about whose territory she was in. She did not think about the rules. She thought about the sound he had made, and she walked faster. She named him Ash, because of the color of his fur in the firelight. For the first week, she did not sleep. She fed him warm broth by the drop, kept him against her side for warmth, and watched him breathe with the concentrated attention of a woman who understood that small things die if you look away. He was the most fragile creature she had ever held. He was also, somehow, the most determined. He fought to stay alive with a stubbornness that felt, in the dark of those first nights, almost personal. By the second week, he was stronger. By the third, he was greedy at feeding time, pushing his nose against her hand and making small, impatient sounds. She laughed at him when he did that. It was the first time she had laughed in longer than she could remember. She should have reported him to the pack wardens, she knew that. A silver wolf cub found on the border path, with a gold-glowing birthmark, that was not an ordinary animal. But she had seen what the pack wardens did with animals they considered unusual. They studied them, they catalogued them. They did not sit on the floor at 3 in the morning rubbing warmth into tiny silver paws. So she kept him, and she told no one. 6 weeks after she brought him home, she woke in the night to find that she was not alone in her bed, in the way she expected. Ash was not beside her as a wolf cub. He was beside her as a small boy, perhaps a 1.5 years old, with silver hair that curled at his ears, and amber eyes that were open, and watching her with calm, serious attention. The crescent mark on his wrist glowed the same faint gold. Elena sat up very slowly. The boy looked at her. She looked at the boy. Then, after a moment, she lay back down, pulled the blanket over both of them, and said quietly, to the dark ceiling, "All right." In the morning, he was a wolf cub again. She did not ask why. She simply added it to the list of things she accepted about him. The way she accepted that he liked to sleep pressed against her spine, that he growled at the wind, and that he always seemed to know when she was sad, even before she knew herself. She called him Ash. She raised him in her cottage. She loved him the way you love something that came to you broken, and then stayed. She did not know his real name. She did not know that 3 years earlier, in the great stronghold of Silverstone Keep, a king had stood in an empty nursery and made a vow in the old language that his people used only for sacred things. She did not know that the king's name was Cale Nightborn, or that he had spent every day since that vow searching, that he had sent trackers and seers and scouts into every corner of the Northern Territory looking for a silver-haired infant with a crescent birthmark. She did not know that the ambush that left Ash in the snow had been planned for months by a rogue faction called the Hollow Fang, whose leader believed that removing the Nightborn heir would collapse the most powerful wolf bloodline on the continent. She did not know any of it. She only knew the boy who sat at her kitchen table and ate bread with both hands, and looked at the forest through the window with amber eyes. 3 years passed. Ash grew into a quiet, serious child who spoke carefully and observed everything. He was curious about animals the way Elena was, not afraid of them, not excited by them, just deeply interested, as if they were a language he already half understood. He helped her care for her patients. He carried water. He held injured birds with a steadiness that surprised her, given how small his hands still were. He did not play with the other children in the settlement. He did not seem to want to. He seemed to want exactly what he had: the cottage, the forest, and Elena. She was enough for him, and he was more than enough for her, and for a time that felt true and complete and permanent. Then the horses came. She heard them early in the morning, a sound of hooves on the frozen ground, more than 4, moving with the kind of coordinated, unhurried speed that meant professionals. She had been waiting for something like this for 3 years, without admitting to herself that she was waiting. She picked Ash up from where he was sitting by the fire. He looked at her face, read it the way he always read her face, and did not ask questions. He simply held on. The door opened before she could reach it. The man who stepped inside was tall in the way that certain men are tall, not just physically, but in the space he occupied, the weight of him in a room. He wore dark traveling clothes with no royal insignia, but everything about him said rank, said power, said this is a person whose decisions have consequences. His hair was dark, his eyes were amber. They were the same eyes as the child in Elena's arms. He saw Ash immediately. His entire body went still, the kind of stillness that is the opposite of calm, the stillness of something trying very hard to hold itself together. His eyes moved from the child's face to the crescent mark on his wrist, which was glowing gold now, brighter than Elena had ever seen it. Then Ash did something he had never done before. He shifted, right there in her arms, from a small boy to a silver wolf pup, and he stretched toward the man with his nose, and he made a sound, low, certain, recognizing. Cale Nightborn dropped to his knees on her kitchen floor. He was a king. He had 17 wardens standing behind him in the yard. He had spent 3 years being unmovable, because moving meant breaking, and breaking meant stopping, and stopping was the one thing he could not allow himself. And he dropped to his knees on a human woman's kitchen floor, because his son pressed a cold nose to his hand, and the world, which had been wrong for 3 years, suddenly tilted back. Elena stood very still, and watched a man come undone in her kitchen, and she held Ash, even after he shifted back to a boy, because her arms did not seem to know what else to do. She expected to be ignored. She expected to be removed, escorted politely but firmly out of a situation that was not hers. She expected the cold efficiency of powerful people who had no use for her. Instead, Cale looked up at her from the floor, and he said simply, "How long?" 3 years, she said. He nodded. He did not say thank you. The word was too small. She could see him understanding that, see him turning it over and finding it inadequate. He simply nodded, and he stood, and he looked at the child who was pressing his face against Elena's shoulder and watching his father with amber eyes. They took her with them, not as a prisoner, as a necessity. Rylan, which was the name the king called him, the name that meant heir and prince and first son, refused to go without her. He wrapped both arms around her neck when the soldiers tried to suggest, gently, that perhaps the lady would be more comfortable at home, and he made himself into a dead weight and a problem, and Elena, who knew exactly why he was doing it, said nothing and let him. The Silverstone Keep was larger than anything she had seen. The halls were wide and the ceilings were high, and everything was made of stone that had been there for centuries, soaked in the particular silence of a place that has held both power and grief. She did not feel small there, which surprised her. She felt, mostly, alert. The court was not warm about her. She was human. She was common. She had no name anyone recognized, and she had somehow spent 3 years raising the crown heir in a cottage near the border without anyone knowing. Several advisors argued, in meetings she was not invited to but heard about anyway, that she should be thanked and compensated and sent home. She sat with Rylan in the evenings and helped him eat his dinner and did not argue with anyone. She only argued when someone suggested changing his sleeping arrangements without asking him first. Then she was very clear. Kale was present in a way she had not expected a king to be present. He was at dinner. He was in the corridor outside Ryland's room at night. He watched her with his son with the quiet attention of a man, cataloging something important, not with suspicion, just with the need to understand something he had not been there for. They talked, the first time, because Ryland had finally fallen asleep, and they were both standing in the corridor, with nowhere urgent to go. She told him about the night she found Ash, the snow, the oak tree, the sound that had pulled her across the dark. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Then he told her about the night he lost him, the ambush, the nursery, the vow in the old language. He spoke without drama, the way people speak about things that have happened so many times in their own minds that they have lost their edges. She listened without looking away. After that, they talked most nights. About small things and large things, and things with no category. She learned that he had not laughed in 3 years either. She learned that he kept the nursery exactly as it was, unchanged, because changing it had felt like accepting something he refused to accept. She learned that he was a better father than he was a king, and that this cost him something in the court, and that he had never once tried to change it. He learned that she had never belonged anywhere before the cottage, that Ash, Rylan, was the first thing that had ever stayed, that she was not afraid of him, which apparently was less common than it should have been. One night she said she supposed she should think about going home eventually. He said Rylan would not allow it. She said she knew. He said, looking at the floor, neither would I. The corridor was very quiet. She looked at her hand, at the small faint mark on her inner wrist she had always taken for a scar, and said nothing. The royal healer told her, the next morning, that it was not a scar, it was a fate bond, an old bloodline mark, written into Nightborn magic generations back. The woman who saves the heir is bound to the line, not by law, by something older than law. Elena stared at her wrist for a long time. Then she walked to where Kale was standing by the window and she said, "Did you know?" He said, "No." Then, "But I don't think I needed the magic." The Hollow Fang came back in midsummer, the way dangerous things do when they believe you have stopped expecting them. They struck during the great court gathering, when the gates were ceremonial and the guards were spread thin. Elena saw them before the alarm was raised, not because she had training, but because she had spent 3 years watching a forest for threats, and she knew how silence changed shape. She took Rylan through the servant passages. She sat with him in the dark of the kitchen stores, and put her hand over his heart, and told him to breathe, and he breathed, because she asked him to. He pressed his forehead against hers in the dark, and he was completely still, and she understood, holding him, that this child had always known he was safe with her, in a way he could not have explained. Kale found them 40 minutes later. He came in with blood on his sleeve, and stopped when he saw them on the floor. Rylan was asleep against Elena's shoulder. Her hand was still shaking slightly. She looked up at Kale. He crossed the room and sat down on the kitchen floor and put his arms around both of them, and he said, "You are not going home," she said into his shoulder. "I know." In the winter, at the edge of the forest, beside the oak tree, where she had found a small silver cub in the snow 3 years before, Kale placed his signet on her finger. Rylan stood between them and pressed his nose to their joined hands, and the crescent marks on his wrist and hers glowed gold in the cold dark. Elena Voss, who had always lived at the edges of things, stood at the center of the only family she had ever been given, and breathed, for the first time in her life, like she was exactly where she was meant to be.